Good afternoon, and I welcome all our guests live streaming. Some people have told me that the live streaming is better than even being here. I don't believe that, because I think to see faces face to face is good, but I'm really pleased that the live streaming is very good. Notice the format for this session is quite different from what we have had up till now. It is a panel discussion, and so requires some explanation as to why we introduced this particular session at this time and how it is hoped it will unfold. We have all been exposed to several ideas on Jesus and the Pharisees from the Gospels, Paul, and rabbinics. We have not yet reached the patristics, the medieval rabbinics, and contemporary portrayals at Oberammergau, cinematography, and textbooks. We thought of introducing a format where we could give several speakers of the conference a chance to present their expectations of the conference and their experience in digesting the content of the conference to date. Hopefully, in the exchanges you may clarify for yourselves what you have brought to the conference and what has been confirmed, transformed, or challenged from the speakers to date. As you can see in the program, we are using a humorous, or at least a light context to set this debate, to tell the truth, as a simple analogy to our search for who the Pharisees were and are in relation to Jesus and to Judaism, and by analogy, between Christians and Jews today. In every analogy, there are similarities and differences, and that is especially true in our case. To say something about the TV show To Tell the Truth, I suspect there are many of you who do not know it. I remember enjoying it as a child. It is an American television panel game in which 4 celebrity panelists, we have 5 here, are presented with 3 contestants, the team of challengers, each an individual or pair, and the panelists must identify which is the central character whose unusual occupation or experience has been read out loud by the show's moderator or host. I'm afraid that has been done through our various speakers to date. When the panelists question the contestants, the 2 imposters may lie, whereas the central character must tell the truth. The setup adds the imposter element to the format of What's My Line and I've Got a Secret, other game shows. Usually at the end of the show, the moderator will ask the 3 contestants, will the true Mr. Smith please stand up? And then, of course, the person stands up, and the panelists are delighted with the fact that they've either guessed who the true one is or are flabbergasted that they were not able to decipher from the various positions presented the true candidate. So as you can imagine, we have many dissimilarities to this, but we have heard various presentations of the Pharisees in the Gospels, in Paul, in rabbinics, and so it is a time, I think, where we can try to sense what is our understanding of the Pharisees and their relationship to Jesus, and by analogy also the relationship between Christians and Jews today. So how will we proceed? So each panelist in a first round will speak of their experience of what has brought them to this conference. This may include their scholarly study, their experience of the importance of this exercise in the conference, and of their investment, personal, communal, and spiritual, into their efforts. In a second round, they will exchange ideas of the effects of the various speakers on their own understanding of the relationship between Jesus and the Pharisees, and perhaps the relationship with Judaism and Christianity as a lived experience today. After this second round, there will be a chance for the panelists themselves to address one another, and then finally, we will open the floor for reactions from the audience, either to share their own experiences of what has brought you to this conference, and to address one of the members with clarification, confirmation, or disagreements. We must never be afraid of disagreements. That is a rabbinical understanding. Now, each panelist has already been presented for the occasion of their own contribution to the conference, except for Professor Joseph Sievers. As you know, Steve Mason was not able to be present. He was originally, as you can see in your program, he was originally meant to be one of the panelists. Although his contribution, Esteem and Criticism of Pharisees and Josephus and Synoptics and Acts, was delivered even with his presence on Skype and through live streaming. I asked Steve Mason who could fill his role in the panel. As you can imagine, he suggested precisely Joseph Sievers, whose familiarity with Josephus and the Pharisees is well known. And so I think this gives Joseph Sievers a chance to participate formally, though he was only too humble to take formal part in the conference that he has organized. So just to remind you who we have in the panel: Adela Yarbrough Collins, Yale University, New Testament, Book of Revelation, 2017, King and Messiah as Son of God, co-authored with her husband John Collins. Mark, a commentary in the Hermenea Commentary series published in 2007. Then next to her, Jean Schroeter of Humboldt Universität Berlin. He's the chair for exegesis and theology of the New Testament, as well as the New Testament apography. Then next to me here, Yair Furstenberg, Hebrew University, Jerusalem, Department of Talmud and Halakha, the Faculty of Humanities. And his research interests, I simply took this from your page, of course, which is very well presented. Research interests: evolution of rabbinic movement, early rabbinic literature, composition of the Mishnah, Halakha during the Second Temple period, the rabbis, and the Greco-Roman world. Then next to Yair, we have Rabbi David Rosen, International Director of Interreligious Affairs of the American Jewish Committee. He has been prolific, really prolific, in advocating peace, interreligious dialogue. It's just incredible if you go to his page. He has been advancing understanding and good relations between religious communities for more than 50 years, from the time he served as rabbi of the largest Orthodox Jewish congregation in South Africa, during his tenure as chief rabbi of Ireland, and throughout the last more than 30 years based in Jerusalem. So my task as moderator will be to keep the discussion going. If someone begins to speak too long, I may intervene. That is the role of the moderator. Whether I will dare to ask either someone in the audience or in the panel, will the true Pharisees please stand up? I may ask it or I may not. I will see how things go. Now, we did not decide today how to proceed. I thought of asking Joseph Sievers. Are you okay with that? And I basically suggested that they speak for some 5 minutes, although if someone goes for 7 minutes, I will not be alarmed.
Thank you very much, Michael. Well, I have a split identity here today in some way, because I speak for Steve Mason, who is my friend and whom I asked to come here, and but I don't have a text from him, and I speak also for myself. Then I can not directly speak out of his experience, but I dare speak out of my own experience. But both have something to do with Flavius Josephus. So there are many things in common. We, on quite a few points, we fairly well disagree, but on many other points, we are also in fair agreement. Perhaps very briefly, how did we meet? I met Steve for the first time at a conference I organized in San Miniato near Pisa in 1992 on Josephus, for the Second Temple period, not so much for the biblical part of his work. And Steve was there, one of the more or less 30 participants. We had the possibility to invite practically all the scholars worldwide that dealt with Josephus at the time. There was someone from Japan, several from the United States, several from Israel. Danny Schwartz was there, and others. And I don't want to give the whole story, but that conference had an influence on further Josephus studies, because it brought together people like Feldman and Mason and others, and some of them worked together later on a commentary and a new translation of Josephus into English. Fine. And I have, Steve has been the main editor, and I have contributed something, although it hasn't come out yet. Since then, we have been in touch. And Steve has put the finger on seeing Josephus as an author, not as a quarry of information, as he has been very often used by many scholars in different fields, especially the classicists had shoved him aside to the theologians, and the theologians had taken from Josephus material that was of interest to them. Steve and a few others insisted that we have to read Josephus as an author before looking for material that we find. Fine, maybe let's decide with Steve for now. My side, very briefly, I was asked in 1991 to give a talk in Naples for Jews and Christians, for the Fellowship of Christians and Jews, about the Pharisees. I don't remember who suggested the topic, but I chose that and then asked, what can I say? And what seemed to me an important approach was personal. Not who were the Pharisees, but who was Mr. or Mrs. Pharisee. I didn't find any misses, but I found people like Paul, like Nicodemus, like Simon, and a few others, about a dozen. And I found that approach was very helpful in getting beyond stereotypes. And that was my first step towards a better historical view of the Pharisees. Is that okay?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Joseph. If we could proceed with Rabbi David Rosen.
I was hoping you weren't going to proceed with me, but at any rate. So actually, you probably know, it's on. At least it says it's on. Okay. There actually, at least the Talmud says there is a woman Pharisee, which it criticizes an example of women who are overly, if you like, exaggeratedly pietistic.
Is that Isha Perusha?
Yeah, it's not the same thing.
Is not necessarily a Pharisee woman, but it's a woman who keeps away from her husband.
So this really highlights one of the problems we're addressing, and that is the way words change and are used and whom they apply to at any one given time, and how these can undergo various, if you like, transmogrifications. And we use, in the world today, we might use a word like Democrats, and we could be applying it to a particular party. We might be applying it to a particular world outlook, to a particular kind of society. In the Jewish community, names to describe denominations have generally been imposed by outside, by others, and not chosen by the people themselves. Or today, for example, one of the most fascinating aspects within the Jewish community is you see the use of the word Hasidic often to apply to ultra-Orthodox Jews from backgrounds which were violently anti-Hasidic and even excommunicated Hasidim. But because a whole new, therefore, winds of change have come over, and the issues are no longer, are you Hasidic or Mitnagdic, but how do you relate to modernity? And therefore, the section of Jewry that has withdrawn from modernity, more correctly described as Haredi or ultra-Orthodox, made up both of Hasidic and anti-Hasidic elements, has become generalized to be described as Hasidic. It's a classic example of the way words change and are applied in different contexts and at different times. But my concern, of course, is the way a term is employed in the present context based on its historical origins. And I didn't even know that it was there, and I'm sure that Joseph is responsible for that. There was a little book that to some extent was a fait accompli. I didn't even realize it was going to come out as a book at the beginning, which is under my name, together with a very well-known evangelical preacher called R.T. Kendall, who has published scores of different books that apparently is within the library, the publications display, called The Christian and the Pharisee. And this little book, which is not really for scholars, it's precisely to be able to address people who do not have background, was a result of a conversation and a series of exchanges that I had with this individual, who I met at an event that was actually convened by the then Archbishop of Canterbury, George Carey, and this man, R.T. Kendall, was the preacher at Westminster Chapel at the time. And he had just brought out a book similar to one that Craig put up on the screen in his presentation, a book that he'd written, I think it was 26 Reasons You Might Be a Pharisee. And I said to him, and he was very proud of this book, and I said to him, you know, you're bearing false witness against me, and therefore you are desecrating one of the 10 Commandments. He was absolutely nonplussed. He says, what do you mean? He says, I see myself as part, therefore, of the Pharisees, the Pharisaic tradition. That's the way we've understood within rabbinic tradition for us to be whom we are. And you are bearing false testimony against me. I don't see myself in the criteria and in the typologies that you're presenting. He says, you consider yourself a Pharisee? I said, yes. He says, you mean that you wear that word as a badge of honor? I said, absolutely. He was absolutely stunned, and to his credit, he said, can we have an exchange on this? I said, with pleasure. So we wrote back and forward, and he was writing and I'm responding. Basically, in this exchange, he's trying to convert me as a good evangelical fundamentalist and trying to show me the error of my ways. And I'm telling him, let me be a good Jew and you be a good Christian, and let's get on together on that particular basis. And the result, it becomes a kind of a primer into understanding the fundamental differences between, if you like, certain Christian and certain Jewish approaches, and hopefully an understanding of Judaism. But it highlighted the problematic use of the term, and is very much where I'm coming from in terms of my fervent desire to work together with Joseph on this particular project, which was very much galvanized by a third party who I'd not given acknowledgement to in my words at the opening yesterday, who is here with us, and that is my colleague here in Rome, Lisa Palmieri-Billig, who is AJC's representative to the Holy See as well as in Italy. And this was made acute by the recognition that paradoxically we live in an era where probably we have the most friendly and familiar relationship with the Jewish people that the church has ever known. And yet at the same time, we see the use of terminology in what I would describe, and excuse me for my lack of diplomacy, very irresponsible manner. Now, how do we deal with that? And the problem is not a prince of the church who you know to be a friend of the Jewish people. The problem is some priest in Bogota who says, hey, the cardinal, or even somebody higher than the cardinal, talks that way about the Pharisees and the Jews, why shouldn't I? So it's particularly important for me, both for us to have the context, the historical context, but to understand how that context can be used and abused in the contemporary situation, so that we can, as I said in my opening words, sensitize people more to the ramifications of the words we use, how we use them, and what their consequences can be.
Thank you very much, David. Adela? As you can see, there's a certain pattern here.
There is? I had my primary religious formation as a Catholic in pre-Vatican II Catholicism. And the Bible at that time was not read very much, but I nevertheless absorbed a very negative understanding of the Pharisees, I assume from readings in the liturgy at the Mass. And I didn't know consciously a Jewish person until I was halfway through high school, when I joined the Ladies Musical Club of Seattle. And the leaders of that group were Jewish, and that was a very positive experience for me. What really deeply changed my understanding of the Pharisees was graduate study in New Testament and related fields, because the stereotype that I had absorbed was that Pharisees were legalistic. In other words, that they were very strict. They had an oppressive and strict interpretation of the Torah or the law and imposed it on people. And then I discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Pharisees were called, at least it's assumed it's the Pharisees being referred to as the seekers after smooth things. They're making it easy for people. And I thought, what? You know, that was a revolution in my mind. And then later, I made a study of blasphemy in relationship to understanding the trial of Jesus, fictional trial of Jesus before the Sanhedrin in Mark. And I discovered that, well, of course, as we know in the Bible, there's a death penalty for blasphemy. And I also, there's some evidence at least that the Sadducees tended to interpret these laws strictly. And for example, they executed an early Christian leader, I think it was James, the brother of the Lord. But the Pharisees argued that the Sadducees and others defined blasphemy as saying anything that diminishes the glory of God. And we see this in some, very ultra-conservative Muslim groups, that there was a Christian woman who, drank out of the same vessel as Muslim women. She was Christian, she was imprisoned and was going to be put to death. So that's theoretically what people could do. But the Pharisees argued that it's only blasphemy if you actually pronounce the name of the Lord. So that made the definition of blasphemy, according to my understanding at least, narrower and much easier to avoid. And And even if death penalty wasn't carried out, which I think normally it wasn't, it's still on the books. But to redefine blasphemy, I think, greatly limits the threat of severe punishment. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you very much, Adela. So now we'll proceed with Yair.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to think of what my more personal perspective of this and to get out of my scholarly position. It's very helpful because in some sense it's true that it's actually a personal voyage that I'm going through in the last 15 years when I've been dealing with these texts. And I think in thinking of it, it also touches some larger issues that really are relevant for current Judaism, even as an Israeli that doesn't deal with contact with Christians on a daily basis, but even when thinking of internal issues within current Judaism. I'm an Orthodox, liberal Orthodox, if you want to define it that way. And so the issue of halakha, the value of law, the limits of the law, is something that I deal with on a daily basis. It's something that I define my community through. How stringent will I be? What's the level of commitment to earlier traditions? Those are questions that I'm really grew up on and asking myself all the time. And suddenly, I got to deal with the New Testament and the Gospel texts. And suddenly I felt that there was someone that was expressing clearly, simply, the kind of issues that were concerning myself and everybody around me. The issue of the value of the law. Now, when you're within the rabbinic system, so I think the rabbinic system is extremely critical. It knows how to be extremely critical, but it's always complicated. There's no clear questions of what is this system about. And suddenly, you go to this text, and a mirror is put in front of you. And that is an illuminating, deeply significant experience. I know when I teach New Testament, I teach about what I spoke this morning. I get excited. I always get excited when I speak. I'm working very hard not to get excited right now. So, and I speak to Israelis that are tour guides, for example, and they always come to me after class, and I'm explaining the debate between Jesus and the Pharisees, and they ask me, tell me, seriously, are you not really a Christian? Because now my identity with the question that Jesus raises against the Pharisees is because I think these are essential questions for any community with the law. Now, law is an issue whether you're Jewish or Christian. That's the framework of the community. So these are essential questions. So suddenly, again, the external point of view that helps clarify these issues. So, in some sense, going back to rabbinic literature, going back to Second Temple literature, it gives an opportunity to go back to the basics. Basics on the existential level of being an observant Jew. And so that makes the debate very, very significant for me. I just want to, I can also tell the story from the point of view, not my personal, but also from I think very scholarly issues. But maybe I'll leave that for the second round.
Thank you, Yair. So Jens.
Thank you. What fascinates me with that conference here is that it is focused on a very specific topic and broadens up historical perspectives on Jews and Christians, or Judaism and Christianity from where. And I think this is a very helpful concept, and Joseph, thanks again very much for that. So I think it's very well structured. And from my personal experience, it is related to what concerns me already for many years. So during my study and also afterwards as a PhD student and so forth, we became more and more aware that Judaism and Christianity are abstractions, at least with regard to the first 3 centuries, and that we should think about ancient Judaism and ancient Christianity as multifaceted and diverse phenomena, and there were various strands and developments and groups and so forth that interacted in various ways with each other. So therefore it is perhaps in some sense misleading abstraction to speak about the relationship of Judaism and Christianity with regard to the first 3 centuries. And I think our discussions here about the Pharisees is a perfect example for that, because in the papers we have heard so far, it became very clear that we have to speak in a very nuanced and differentiated way about this group that is called the Pharisees, and we should be very cautious to think that we would know who these people were, whom we call the Pharisees. That became already clear in the very first paper that dealt with designation, the Pharisees, and also in the other ones. So, and I think this is very important for us to realize how complex these historical phenomena were, and that is also important for our image of the relationship of Judaism and Christianity in antiquity and perhaps also today. So, and this whole discussion, which you are probably aware of, about the so-called parting or partings of the ways, has also clearly shown that that is not a very helpful a metaphor to speak about the parting or partings of the ways. So the conference for me belongs into this broader framework, and therefore it is quite a productive topic and way of dealing with such a theme, and also with the overall hermeneutical problems related to that. And the last remark from the discussion reminds me, in hermeneutical and methodological perspective, of the discussion about the historical Jesus. So we have discussed similar issues about how to use ancient sources to ask historical questions and to reconstruct a historical person or a historical movement, that we have to be very careful in methodological and hermeneutical regard. And I think this is quite similar with approach to the Pharisees as well. So there are many methodological and hermeneutical questions involved here in speaking about the Pharisees, not at least because of reception history and of stereotypes that are around about the Pharisees for a long time. So, and this is my background and my perception of the conference and of the discussion so far.
Thank you, Jens. So now we'll have a second round. We'll proceed in the same order, so that way you'll know when you are to speak. Now, what we thought of doing here is to gather some ideas on reactions that you have had to what you have heard, either on this panel right now, but especially through the other presentations of the speakers that we've heard yesterday and today. What has affected you? Perhaps what you are critical of, we have no fear of that, or perhaps what has opened your mind, opened perhaps even your heart, just to gather some reactions on how you have been changed or affected by what you have heard so far. Joseph.
Okay, well, I'm very grateful to all of you who have spoken, who have worked preparing papers and brought your ideas. And I must confess, first of all, that my mind was not always present with all the talks. Sometimes it was caught up in other things. So, but I can say that I've learned more subtle ways to use, first of all, the name of the Pharisees. I found that was, the first paper was a very helpful reminder of what's in a name. And I think I and we have to be more attentive to that. Another thing, two things where I've learned things is an attention to Qumran, even though it doesn't mention the name Pharisee, but that we can suppose that in some cases Pharisees are meant. But here I come also to the difficulty that is even clearer in the archaeological record. When there is no name, how are we sure that these are the people that are really meant? But to look at these, to get a better understanding of the world in which Pharisees and others lived, that is very important. How much we can come down to defining clearly a group, that's, for me, it's an open question.
Thank you, Joseph.
Thank you. I know I'm next.
Yeah.
To be honest, I actually I thought that the paper's been wonderful, and I have learnt some fascinating esoteric stuff. I'm not sure that I've learnt much that changes my general understanding either with regards to Jesus or the Pharisees. But what I have felt at certain moments during the presentations is that there have been one or two problematic presentations which seem to me to have reflected not so much a lack of sensitivity as a lack of familiarity. Familiarity with the characters who I feel that I'm familiar with. In a sense, what I felt sometimes is that the speakers don't know me as well as I would like to be known. And that has also highlighted for me an awareness that this conference itself embodies what I think we have to strive for, which are two elements which need to live side by side and are very often dislocated from one another. One is the serious scholarly analysis and research, and the other is the human encounter, to utilize Joseph's quotation at the opening, the friendship. And when we know one another, then the way we actually understand what we understand is profoundly affected. And my suspicion is that those presentations that I felt were somewhat problematic reflected the lack of familiarity of those behind them with especially contemporary Jewish life. And therefore, I really feel that we have to work upon the marriage between these two elements embodied in this conference more and more for the benefit of us all. Could I just add, and it's not just that point, but also a lack of familiarity with documents of the church that relate to knowing one another. the documents which I referred to in my opening statement. And it stuns me time and again that I come across bishops, and sometimes even more than bishops, who do not know the guidelines on Nostra Aetate of 1974, and do not know the notes on the preaching and teaching on Jews and Judaism notes of 1985, and do not know about the Hebrew Bible in Christian Scriptures, the document that comes out of the Pontifical Biblical Commission, which, for me, it seems, I would imagine it should be bread and butter, but it's not. And that's an enormous challenge, which I can only, if you like, be a voice encouraging it, but is ultimately for the church to take on. Doesn't mean we don't have plenty of things to do ourselves. Of course we do. And we are still, to a large degree, in a Jewish community, under the impact of the tragic experience of history, which we have to overcome. But from a historic point of view, I can't be sure that there, but for the grace of God, we would have been necessarily any better. But the fact was, we were on the receiving end. And therefore, the primary responsibility, I think, in traversing this gulf, it lies with the church.
Right. A couple of things I want to mention. First is to respond to that last point that you made, David, and that is about the documents. When I was at Notre Dame, there was a conference on Nostra Aetate, and familiarity with the document was aided, and discussion of it. And then again, since I was at Yale, Fordham had a conference on the anniversary of the publication of that document. And so I think we need more things like that for scholars, and we need more things like that for pastors of Catholics and others. Secondly, a quite recent important experience for me on the issue of Jesus and the Pharisees was provided by a conference that Jens organized in Berlin. It was on the diversity of ancient Judaism, and diversity was taken really seriously. It was very interesting. And he asked me to speak about what kind of a Jew is the Jesus of Mark. And at the same time, I'd been reading some chapters that Menachem Kister asked me for feedback on in what he said about the New Testament. And I looked at Mark. You know, I had worked in the commentary on the Jewish traditions that are incorporated in Mark and that are relevant for understanding Mark, but I'd never looked at that particular issue. What kind of a Jew was Jesus? And I suddenly saw that Jesus was, at least the Markan Jesus, very comfortable with halakhic argument. You know, and the Sabbath controversies, it was all there, and especially Mark 7. And I did realize that when I was writing the commentary, how complicated these prohibitory vows are, and how even Mark, who's usually thought of as a Gentile, writing for Gentiles, how Mark understood the prohibitive vow. So that was kind of exciting for me to look, and to look at the temple also. Many readers of Mark say, they talk about the anti-temple theme in Mark. And that's just wrong. Mark is not anti-temple. You know, and the cursing of the fig tree is not about the temple or Jewish leaders, or heaven forbid, as some scholars actually say, Judaism itself, you know, should wither and cease to exist. And I think some of those scholars stand in the line of the documents of the early church against the Jews, the disputations. And then quickly, I'd like to say a little bit about gleanings from the conference. And I've learned from every paper, but I want to mention 4 that especially connected with where I am on some of these issues. One was Craig Morrison's, that he validated in a clear, logical, scholarly way an instinct, an intuition that I had. Whenever I tried to work on the etymology of Pharisee, I just couldn't do it. I would drop it. It wasn't taking me anywhere. It wasn't helpful. So I like that idea that that's not the way to get at the Pharisees, whether literary characters or historical figures. I also appreciated his highlighting Leo Beck's reference to Leviticus 20:26, that God speaking, I am a Pharisee and you, Israel, should be Pharisees. And the translation in the RSV is holy. I am holy, as you should be holy. And I like that translation of Pharisee. And Steve Mason, I talked about the blasphemy and the discovery of the Pharisees as lenient. And I appreciated Steve Mason's tendency of the Pharisees toward leniency of punishments, reported by Josephus in the Against Apion. And it's especially interesting because Josephus did not agree with that. And then Vered validated that leniency of the Pharisees, or highlighted it in other cases other than punishments. So I found that very interesting and helpful. Now, a couple of issues, the use of certain terms troubled me, and I think it may be helpful to discuss these. It's not at the heart of our enterprise, but I think it's important for studying anything that has to do with the New Testament and ancient Judaism. Two scholars used the term common Judaism. And I know one of them was Eric Myers, and I forget who the other one was. Anyone want to confess? And, I thought we were done with that phrase, that that had been criticized and we shouldn't use it anymore. Now, I was a little more open to it because I think the way Eric was using it was widespread practices. Stone vessels, assuming that means purity and not just fashion, ossuaries, and mikvaot. But in terms of ideas, I think a term like that kind of replaces the old term that I thought we were done with, that I think Yair used, normative Judaism. And that I think is privileging rabbinic Judaism. At least that's what I heard when you said that. And what about First Enoch? And what about all the apocalypses and the very wide variety of texts and ideas that you get in ancient Judaism? So, if others are interested, we could discuss that issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Adela. And so, Yair?
Thank you very much. I used that phrase, and you're right. I didn't think of the old usage. I just what is in the realm of would be viewed as normal, not in the sense of normative. But you're right. Okay, thank you. The first thing I just want to reflect on the fact that there's something I appreciate in the way the self-consciousness of scholarship from the Christian side of it, from the New Testament side of it, to the responsibility of scholarship and the way the words, the terms that scholars use, as David mentioned before, is not something that happened in a vacuum, right? And it has implications on the way we think and act, and in some sense that's something that I feel that is lacking in our own, at least in the academic circles that I'm in, where you view their scholarship as standing into itself and not enough really thinking of the responsibility of scholars in this sense. So I think this is cannot be taken for granted, and I think that is significant. Now, there are a few things that I was thinking through the conference, and the conference is part of a general scholarly tendency that if I'll compare 2 points in comparison to the scholarly sources I come from, so. If we would have asked someone that was concerned with the issue of Jesus and the Pharisees an Israeli scholar, take for example David Flusser, who's really the head of the field in Israel. So his assumption, his way to normalize the relationship between Jesus and the Pharisees is by making Jesus a Pharisee, right? Jens mentioned this kind of scholarship. And in a sense, beyond particular points of affinity and significant connections, and there's no doubt there are significant issues, I think historically it's impossible to reconstruct such an argument. But what's more important to me to say that it's very interesting to see what has changed within the way scholars of ancient Judaism do with this issue. And the fact that I feel very comfortable with describing Judaism as a complex, incoherent, full of tensions within Second Temple Judaism. That's something that, again, in order to normalize the relationship, you don't have to harmonize the views. And that's something that you can really see in the development of people that now I'm in a generation that feels more confident about this situation, about this possibility, and saying, no, I absolutely don't think there's any kind of real connection between the Pharisees and Jesus, and he uses these sources and these sources, and and I think that itself is helpful for what David was talking about what kind of relationship are we striving for. And that's why I also don't fear the fact that etymologically Pharisees means separatist. I think in my own view, as I mentioned yesterday briefly, it's not... if we have Jews, and I don't know what the etymological source is, but if we have Jews using it in this sense, it does not automatically make it a negative meaning. Doesn't automatically acquire a negative meaning, but it requires responsibility to understand how does a society of Second Temple period, how does it work with this complexity? And I found it fascinating, the fact that Josephus, when he describes the ideal Judaism, is a Judaism that has sects. That's the ideal Judaism. He's not saying it just because he feels uncomfortable. You have a few philosophies, you have Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. And can we think of such a system that we would feel comfortable about? That's one thing. On another level, I think that concerns I see myself concerned both on a scholarly level, but also reflecting on myself, also on more maybe political level, is the attempt, or is the approach. The approach that marginalizes the status of the Pharisees within Second Temple Judaism. And we have that. It was a fascinating fact that we learned from Steve yesterday, that they're scarcely mentioned in Josephus's works. What does that mean? That is very humbling. That is truly very humbling, the fact that they're mentioned but what does it mean? And then you have other scholars continuing this very same tendency towards rabbinic, the rabbinic movement. Yeah, until a generation ago, we assumed that was the dominant group. Now it's not, that it become completely marginalized in historiography of the rabbinic period. Now, besides the scholarly issue, is it a good reading and interpretation of the text? And that's something I'm always concerned about. There is something about what kind of significance or social, political, or public significance do we give religious leaders? And that's a question when the Pharisees or the rabbis are marginalized in the historiography, what it creates is a religiosity. The rabbis are concerned with law, but the law becomes a personal thing, because although they're talking about many, many things, that in fact, for historical fact, they're a small community. They're creating a possibility for the individual to have his own religious life. That's exactly the way Neusner, in his book From Politics to Piety, tried to argue that the Pharisees stopped being part of the political realm and decided to eat in purity. That means to transform into a individual, personal, religious life. So I don't think it makes sense in the world of antiquity to talk in these terms, but on a deeper level, what is the kind of status of religious leaders within the community, or how is the best way to imagine their status? Is there a possibility that people without formal authority, like the Pharisees or like the rabbis later on, really had deep influence, significant influence on the people? So talking about the issues of as Pharisee, a religious term, and again, I'm scare quoting this term because it's a modern term, but is it a more issue of religious authority, or how much is it political? How much can we trace difference between text exactly on this issue? So those were the kind of questions that I was stimulated by in the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yair. So Jens.
I found it very helpful, but due to the rather narrow focus of the conference, it was and still is possible to treat the topic in a very broad, almost comprehensive way. So I found it very productive to hear how these various sources were interpreted by experts. So that was for me a very good experience, and I also want to. So I liked it to hear about all of these different interpretations, and I want to highlight 4 of the papers that we have heard. The first one, Vered Noam's paper about 4Q MMT. I've learned a lot about that difficult text. So I've struggled with that several times, and I think it's difficult to interpret this text from the Qumran scrolls. And for me, it was very impressive how Vered did that. So this was for me it was a highlight, because I'm not an expert on that text, and so it was very interesting for me. Second paper I want to mention especially is Craig Morrison's opening paper on linguistic approach, and for me it was important that he reminded us that the meaning of a certain term is not necessarily, or perhaps not even at all, related to its origin, to its etymology, and that this is important for our usage of the term Pharisees was shown very clearly in that paper. And so I think it was a very important opening of the whole conference, and we should be aware of that when we use this term, the Pharisees. And then I liked Eric Meyer's skepticism about using archaeological material for defining Pharisaic Judaism before 70. So of course we have some of these archaeological remains, synagogues and mikvaot and so forth, but it is very difficult to relate these archaeological remains to a specific Jewish group. Of course, there is evidence about a Jewish population in the Galilee or in Judea or wherever, but to relate, and some scholars have tried to do that, and I think Eric Myers has shown very clearly that it is not possible, or at least it is very shaky to try to relate this evidence to a specific kind of Judaism. So that was for me it was helpful and important. And the fourth paper I want to mention especially is Günther Stemberger's also a skeptical paper about the continuity between the Pharisees and the rabbis, and in a analogous way to Eric Meyer's, also Günther Stemberger showed that we should be cautious of using texts in this case for defining a specific Jewish group, and not all of the rabbinic texts, as we all know, can be, not all of those texts who mention a certain group can be related to the Pharisees specifically. And so I think these papers have brought up quite a helpful approach to speak about the Pharisees, and perhaps one of the most important outcomes of that conference so far is that the conference related these different views on the Pharisees with each other. So this was my impression so far with these specific papers which I found especially helpful.
Thank you very much for the entire panel, for the first round and the second round. We had originally thought of whether or not you would want to have a brief moment of saying something to one another. I just want to remind us that we're already at 16:08, so we have another 22 minutes. But Adela has her hand up. How can I say no? Adela.
I found much of what Yair was saying to be quite interesting and stimulating. I'd just like to respond quickly to a couple of things. You know, your advocacy of etymology and the understanding of separatists. In trying to understand your position, I wonder if part of the issue isn't Hebrew, the Hebrew language in general, and the use of it by the rabbis in particular, that there's a lot of punning and wordplay and connecting one text to another because of either the same term or the same root used in a different way. And I can see why etymology might be more important in that linguistic context. You mentioned Neusner's book, From Politics to Piety, and I think piety is not apolitical. And this may be your point of view, I'm not sure where you stood, but you know, the feminists and other critics of social and cultural structures have said, you know, the personal is political. And I think the Pharisees were still political, even though they didn't have a king or queen to support them officially. They were, I think Tony Saldarini had a good point. They were both religious teachers and a political interest group. And they had a great influence because they wanted to, and because we could use Max Weber to say there are two kinds of authority, official and charismatic. You know, there's a gift. And their authority is conferred on people without office because they have something to offer. And I think the Pharisees were like that.
I completely agree, but I think that scholars, I think Neusner, the whole point of Neusner is to make them apolitical. That's why I understand. No, I completely agree. And also the same kind of move is done towards the rabbi. So it's very interesting just to see how once Morton Smith laid the ground for arguing for the marginalization of the Pharisees, even though later Stephen rejected his view, that enabled a much larger element. So you can say there is you can say we're marginalizing the Jews. I don't think that's the way that's the issue, but it's offering a view of Judaism as an apolitical or rabbinic Judaism, Pharisaic and then rabbinic Judaism, as an apolitical. And I must say, I was thinking of it right now. Maybe it's my Zionist inclination here, but it's a view of the of what the significance of what you mentioned of religious authority in Weber's.
But the rabbis were not anymore trying to revolt against Rome, or anymore trying to be political in that way.
But they offered a form of shaping Jewish society. I mean, that was a program.
Well, again, thank you very much. So we have only 18 minutes. Now, I know this can be a little difficult to handle a group like this, but I would like to suggest that if someone would like to address the group, even share your experience, or to address one person on the panel, this is your chance. Eric. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you all for your comments, and I think I'm going to address mine wearing a different hat to Rabbi Rosen and to the organizer, Joseph Sievers, and you, Michael. It has to do with the word Pharisee in American parlance today, which has been the occasion for violent anti-Semitism, negative assessment of the Jewish public, I'm sure in England, South Africa as well. And my wife and I just addressed a ecumenical group of clergy in North Carolina last week, and I'm chairman of an ecumenical committee. And with the rise of anti-Semitism in the United States and around the world, the group of Christian clergy said that in addition to the negative depiction of Jews in the New Testament, what bothered them most was the ongoing perception that in the Hebrew Bible, the God is a God of violence, and in the New Testament, Jesus is a man of peace. And that these aspects of the ecumenical endeavor, these two facets, contribute to the current tension in their congregations and in the public mind. And I thought if you have expressed, Michael, at the outset, and you, Joseph, that perhaps what happens at this Congress, this conference, might improve things on the ground. I love academic debates. I love these presentations. But the public out there, despite online streaming, despite the publication that will come out, the people in the pulpit, I'm not sure going to get it. And Rabbi Rosen, you addressed this in some of your comments. Perhaps you're the one to respond. What can be done on a larger scale to really improve things on the ground?
Okay.
Thank you so much. I mean, that's the ultimate question, for me at any rate, in terms of our gathering here. And I think you've highlighted just one aspect of the problematic polemic. There are so many different canards and stereotypes that are out there. Of course, I don't want to be too pessimistic in this regard, where we consider where we are today in comparison with where we were 80 years ago, let alone 50 years ago. We've come an enormous distance, and we have a lot to celebrate. We all know the difference between the optimist and the pessimist. But why does the pessimist see the glass half empty, and why does the optimist see it as half full? The pessimist is the unrealistic one who comes from on top expecting to see a full glass, and therefore he's disappointed with everything he sees that's missing. The optimist comes from underneath. He knows the glass was empty, and therefore he can celebrate everything that's in it. And therefore I think anybody that has a historical perspective in terms of Christian-Jewish relations realize that we live in a golden era, wonderful era. But the fact that we've achieved as much doesn't mean that there's still not a long way to go, and I think you're highlighting some of those. So in the area that we are talking about, because I think there are, again, so many different aspects that need to be addressed, and of course, again, in parenthesis, anti-Semitism isn't something that, a phenomenon that exists in isolation of other biases, prejudices, extremism, and insularity and intolerance. But in the context that we're talking about, it seems to me that the fundamental challenge is to combat a neo-Marcionism. The tragedy of our relationship is the deracination of the church from its Jewish roots. The fact, therefore, that Christians look at their sacred texts out of context. When it can be seen as, therefore, discussion and debate within the family, then you relate to these ideas in a totally different way. And indeed, the language in the Talmud, or the way the rabbis speak to one another, is actually far more extreme than any language that's even used within some New Testament passages. So I think that the most important challenge for the Christian world, if it seeks to contribute to combating anti-Semitism, is to affirm, reaffirm, and deepen as much as possible the sense of its Jewish rootedness. The more Jewish the church feels, of course, I'm not suggesting that I want to encourage any form of syncretism, but I think it's really important for the church to recapture that sense of rootedness. The more rootedness, the less likely it's going to fall into these kind of Manichaean juxtapositions and contrasts. I could go on a lot, but I hope that's of some value.
Okay, I would like to give order to three persons that I see. There's I don't know your name, but a nice blue shirt and a nice. Okay. And then I would indicate Agustinus Gianto and then Mark Rastoin, just so that the people with the microphones can do it. Please.
I could put on my jacket, but I'm Israeli. Alon Goshen Gottstein is the name. And I'd like to make more explicit something that David Rosen said, though he did say it for those who heard, and to put it in the context of tomorrow's audience with the Pope, as a way of looking at the issues of concrete steps that reach beyond the academy and into life of Jews and Christians. To do so, with your permission, I'd like to quote 2-3 sentences from a book that came out just a few months ago. It's called Pope Francis, an Interreligious Dialogue, edited by Harold Kasimov, Alan Race, with foreword by Rabbi Avram Skorka. Our colleague Edward Kessler wrote a response to some of the thoughts on interreligious relations that have been put forth by Pope Francis, and he also offered some criticism, and I will just read you 2-3 sentences and conclude with a question. So he writes the following, except that I've lost my marker, and here it is. The caricature of the Pharisees as hypocrites and legalists has resulted in much misunderstanding about the period to which Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism trace their origins. Pope Francis seems too often to draw on the gospel accounts in which the Pharisees are depicted as the leaders of the Jewish people who oversaw a legalistic, exclusive religion lacking any sense of charity and compassion, without nuance or context. In other words, he charges that the Pope uses these tropes without nuance or context. He goes on. I will just conclude because I don't want to read too much. But he concludes. While Pope Francis' comments to fostering better relations between Christians and Jews, as well as to Christian-Jewish dialogue in general, is undoubted, his inappropriate language is an area of weakness and cause of concern, especially when his homilies and speeches are read by Catholics far away from real encounters with Jews and Judaism. This is what David Rosen was referring to as someone who's above a cardinal. Now, I contextualize this in tomorrow's meeting, and I pose the following question to the organizers. I don't know what the agenda is. I don't know who's speaking. But is it possible that beyond the cordialities and generalities that will obviously be pronounced in the spirit of good friendship between the religions, one of the speakers representing this forum can talk about the challenge for preaching and address the Holy Father with a request to set the example of how to incorporate the lessons of nuance and historical awareness in his own preaching so that Christian preachers worldwide cannot repeat those mistakes and come away with the positive lessons of our conference.
Good. Maybe I can respond to that. We have communicated ideas for the Pope to address to us, and so it'll be interesting to see, in fact, how these will be incorporated. So, in fact, we have anticipated some of these things. So it will be, for me, very interesting to see what he says. Okay, I'm going to say this. I hope you don't mind. No, in fact, I won't. Let's go to Agustinus Gianto.
Is it okay? Is it on? Yeah. I just wanted to share my reaction to this conference. First of all, I'm a bit marginal to this, even if I'm dealing with Hebrew stuff and Aramaic. But for me, this event has clarified a number of issues. The sources, when we talk about the Pharisees as a group or as a religious kind of faction, then most of the papers I've heard have put clearly, these are the sources and how we treated the sources. I find this very important. There are different opinions there, and this is exactly what what is expected to be to happen in such a meeting. Just to share another thing, my own ideas of the Pharisees, I should admit that's a bit old-fashioned. It's only it came from the ideas that had been set by Ewald and Wellhausen, and it seems that these two people are still very much influential even today. And thank you for your papers that you have qualified a bit. And I would like to point it out as Yair's intervention at the end. You said something that the Pharisees, for you, it's connected with the legal attitude of whatever the formulation you use. But I understand this will open a new prospect that what we always call Pharisees would be a group across religious communities. So it is not just the Jews, it's not whatever, that kind of marginal groups, but it is a religious attitude that has something to do with a certain attitude toward law. What I had expected, now this is another from this, even if my colleague Craig has something like that, I would like to have a professional linguist dealing with modern languages, talking about the usage of words connecting with that kind of Pharisees, English, French, and next to me there was somebody who just mentioned to me that she said that, well, why is not there any feminine form of Pharisees? And she said that La Pharisienne, François Mauriac. And why? Of course, this is just to add some spice to my interference. But these are the real issues where the words have its own independence once it's used by a community of people. A professional linguist would be able to go beyond etymologies and goes into the social factors of how these terms have become like that, and will tie up with the intervention of my colleague at the other side. So that is what I would like to say.
Thank you, Agustinus. Mark?
Yes, I want to, I'm a Pauline scholar teaching here at the Biblicum. I'm always struck by a sentence of my Dr. Vater who says that at the end of the day, the only Pharisee we know for sure before 70 is Paul. And the fact is, at the end of this morning, I had this impression of the Pharisees as a rather urban Jerusalem movement that is trying to make roads into Galilee, but a bit as an outsider movement, and in a lot of polemics with the Sadducees within Jerusalem. And I was wondering about this little sentence of Paul, Pharisee, son of a Pharisee, and the fact that he is from Tarsus is not really discussed. So what can we do about, or is it, can we discuss? But if not, the Pharisaism as a diaspora movement. So what it is to be a Pharisee in Tarsus? There is no temple, there is certainly a synagogue, but the diaspora element in that question, because I think we were pretty much in Jerusalem. But I think perhaps, and we're for sure, I mean he's sincere when he's saying he's a Pharisee, son of Pharisees. So clearly it's a kind of tradition of Pharisees in Tarsus. What kind of insight this information brings to the debate?
Adela?
When I was a graduate student, the standard opinion was that Paul's the only Pharisee we know, and he was in the diaspora, therefore he became a Pharisee in Tarsus. But Martin Hengel argued in one of his books that the fact that Paul identifies as a Pharisee validates the tradition in Acts that he studied in Jerusalem, not necessarily with Gamaliel. I forget what position Hengel took on that point. But that makes sense, because Paul says, I was zealous for the traditions of my ancestors beyond others of my generation. Well, what would somebody like that do? He'd go to Jerusalem to study and probably became a Pharisee there.
Does it explain son?
I think that's probably wrong. You know, that Paul doesn't say, I am a Pharisee, son of Pharisees. He says, I am a Hebrew, son of Hebrews. And I think Acts extends, you know, he substitutes Pharisee there, but I don't think that's historical. It doesn't make sense to me anyway.
One last question.
This recalls for me Gregory Tatum's observation that Paul's the only Pharisee we have publications from. And there's this inflects the issue of the so-called parting of the ways, which is a metaphor everybody uses and everybody loathes. But there's a presumption that somehow being a Pharisee is incompatible with being a follower of Jesus, and that somehow Paul is an ex-Pharisee, whereas we have somebody in the New Testament who is contemporary with the apostles, who presents himself as a follower of Jesus, and who doesn't ever claim to be an ex-Pharisee. That becomes our presupposition because we think of it as something that's incompatible. And I just wonder, Paul for me has been the missing person in a conference on Jesus and the Pharisees, because he's placed to give us more information about diaspora Pharisee-ness. And what do you think of that?
Adela,
In
again,
the
the last
context-
word to women.
His being a Pharisee is one of the list of things that he can boast of in the flesh. And he says, and I consider them all scubala, I think is the term, you know, garbage. I leave all that in comparison, that's right. So he doesn't reject those things, and you know, that's part of his identity. And he can bring those things up, some of them, again, with the super apostles, that he has as much to boast about as they do in the flesh. So he relativized, you know, to what degree he's still, maybe his apocalypticism comes from there, maybe his way of interpreting scripture. Say more?
Perhaps also his view of a Jewish law, of the importance of the Jewish law can come from his Pharisaic background. But I think it is a bit dangerous to construct diaspora Pharisaism from this very single phrase, kata nomon Pharisaios. It can also mean that Paul became a Pharisee by way of his education in Jerusalem. So it does not necessarily mean that he was a Pharisee by birth, so to speak, in Tarsus. And we do not have any evidence about Pharisees in the diaspora. So we have most of the evidence points to Jerusalem, and we have some evidence for Pharisees who showed up in the Galilee, but that's it. And so I think it's a very interesting question how the Pharisees came into contact with Jesus at all. So, but anyway, so I wouldn't make too much of that single phrase in Philippians 3 that Paul was kata nomon Pharisaios. So.
On the other hand, perhaps Paul could de-emphasize that, but you might not be able to take the Pharisee out of him. You know what I mean? He's still.
All right, I think it's time to bring this to a close. I want to thank all of the panelists for their contributions here. I would like to thank the audience.